Hello and welcome back to another Parry This video. Today we are taking a break from history, as I sometimes like to do, and we are taking a look at a topic from another world that I love to talk about. That one being Tolkien's world, Middle-earth. Many of you may be familiar with a video I made a few years back critiquing the fortress Helm's Deep. More accurately, the Hornburg, specifically. In that video, I specifically critiqued the representation of the fortress as it is seen in the Peter Jackson trilogy, specifically in the second film, The Two Towers. In today's video, we are going to be doing something similar, but this time the subject will be Edoras, the capital city of the Kingdom of Rohan. Now, just like my Helm's Deep video, I want to be crystal clear here. Although, no matter how clear I am, history has taught me that some people will just be too dumb to understand the distinction. I am only talking about how Edoras is depicted in the Peter Jackson films, period. That's it. I'm not criticizing how the city was described in the books. I'm taking a visual look at Edoras as Peter Jackson presented it, and I will be critiquing the design of Edoras based on historical context. Does everybody understand? That means you can't refute what I'm saying in this video with some variation of, well, in the books, because we're not talking about the books. There. Now that we are all crystal clear, let's get to it. So, for starters, visually speaking, I like the design of Edoras. I think it does a decent job of fitting a clearly Anglo-Saxon inspired fortress city into a high fantasy world, so neither one of those feels out of place. Visually speaking, it does a great narrative job telling us everything we need to know about Rohan in a few seconds. We immediately get an Anglo-Saxon vibe from the building style. We understand that this is a very different culture than what little glimpses of Gondor that we've already seen. These are not the men of Westerness. This is not a high medieval society. These men are lesser men. In Lord of the Rings terms, they are middlemen. And Peter Jackson's depiction of Edoras works perfectly at showing this. The wooden buildings, the palisade wall, the thatched roofs, Medjuseld, the Norse Great Hall, with a fire burning in the middle of the room, horse iconography everywhere. What we see in those first few establishing shots teaches anyone, even those who are unfamiliar with the world, who the men of Rohan are, and what it's like to live there. So please, consider that while I am going to be heavily critiquing the design of this town from a historically accurate point of view, I do appreciate the design from a narrative point of view. And I do personally believe that any of the flaws that I'm going to point out do not hurt the story in any meaningful way. After all, we do not see any Battle of Edoras, because when the time came for danger and war, the King of Rohan fled to the stronghold of the Hornburg, which we've already discussed. Edoras was too vulnerable and exposed, and not as defensible. And that is also perfect, at least from an Anglo-Saxon point of view. See, it wasn't until Alfred the Great, and later his son Edward the Elder, that England, as an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, really had much in the way of fortifications. Prior to these two kings building a system of military forts across the country to be used in the defense of Wessex and other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under their influence, there were only a few fortified settlements that could be considered very defensible at all. In the north, there was York, which, to be fair, was a fairly well-fortified town at the time, and is what I would actually like to see as an Anglo-Saxon-inspired capital in fantasy like The Lord of the Rings. But in Wessex, even Winchester, an old Roman town with surviving Roman fortifications, was not all that defensible, and Winchester was the capital of Alfred's Wessex. So in the times of war, when he had his forts, he would flee the capital and set up the country's defense in the forts that they had built strategically to defend the kingdom. And importantly, this worked. It proved so effective that Wessex not only resisted conquest, but eventually bounced back, and through one way or another brought all of England under not just Anglo-Saxon control, but a single dynasty, that being the House of Wessex. So why is all of that important? Well, because that's where we get the narrative plot beat in The Lord of the Rings, where Theoden leads his people out of his fortified capital so they can take refuge in a military fortress. So some people might be wondering what I'm going to criticize. If the design makes narrative sense and they aren't using the city to defend themselves, what's the problem? Well, there are actually lots of them, so let's dive on in. For starters, Rohan is not England. Yes, there are comparisons to be made, but the differences are huge. For starters, just in terms of size, Rohan is estimated to be approximately 52,763 square miles, which is just slightly larger than England. I find this to be the most accurate estimate, although I have seen other estimates saying that it's actually closer to 160,000 square miles, or approximately the size of California. I personally find that to be unlikely, so we're going to stick to the approximate size of England. The problem here is that by the time that England was actually a unified and cohesive kingdom, the fortress or burg system was done and dusted. The fortified personal homes, or castles, were the defensive mode of choice at that time, and the difference there is huge. When your home, the place where you live, is fortified and designed to house a military force and to withstand attack, surprise attacks become much more difficult. Basically, every little fortified manor house across the kingdom becomes a potential thorn in an attacker's side. Taking them is often a difficult and dangerous task that will deplete your army, and importantly, it also leaves you super exposed to counterattack from other forces in the kingdom. This is why the castle system is superior to the military fort system. But Rohan, despite being a unified nation with external enemies constantly threatening them, has not evolved their military design at all. They have not progressed beyond early Dark Age civilization in most ways. They have a small number of population centers, Edoras purportedly being the largest of them, and then they have a bunch of scattered settlements and villages, and a couple strongholds like Dunharrow or Helm's Deep. And Rohan mostly feels empty. For Alfred, fleeing Winchester to get to his nearest burg was no more than a few hours' march. They weren't that far apart. It takes the force leaving Edoras days to reach Helm's Deep. That's a lot of time exposed on the road, and that right there is enough of a weakness in this strategy that makes it too large to bear. That reason alone is enough to say this is a mistake. Edoras, the capital city, should instead be fortified. It should be strong enough to defend itself and the people within it. And that's why we're making this argument. So let's start off with some really basic stuff. The first point I want to make is that actually not a military one at all. It's a logistical flaw in Peter Jackson's design of Edoras, and that flaw is the absence of any farmland around the city. During the approach to Edoras, we see massive open grassy plains. We see rocks. We see a couple small structures that could possibly be homesteads, but what we don't see is tillable farmland. You could make the argument that Rohan subsists off of hunting and pasture-raised animal, but it would be a flawed argument. We see no large bodies of water that could be providing any meaningful amount of fish. We see no nearby forest that could be providing birds nor beasts enough for the people of Edoras to live off of, and we see no herds of grazing cattle or sheep. There is no sign of agriculture and no nearby natural resources that would explain what the people in this city eat. This is not a flaw unique to Edoras, as Peter Jackson constantly makes this mistake. In a medieval society, the food source needed to be nearby the population center. They weren't getting their food trucked in on semis, and they didn't have refrigeration. So if you had a large group of people living in one area, you also needed fields, pastures, and the ability to process those goods. And we see nothing of that sort at Edoras. So that is the first major flaw in its design. The next thing I want to talk about is the construction of the city itself. If you take a look at Edoras, what do you see? Well, you see a very Anglo-Saxon inspired settlement. Wood buildings, thatched roofs. Good, right? Well, yes, that would make a lot of sense if Edoras was built near a large forest. But do you see any large forest? Or better yet, do you see any trees at all? No, because there aren't any. Edoras sits upon a large rocky outcrop in the middle of a very large open area with nothing but rocky hills and open fields between foothills and mountains. Literally not a tree in sight. So where do they get all that lumber? Well, you could argue that they ship it in from elsewhere in the kingdom, and sure, fair enough, except that doesn't make any sense, because why would you choose this spot to build if you knew every board was going to have to be carted in from another corner of the kingdom? And this is compounded by another issue. What resource do you see a lot of very nearby? One that medieval defensive structures were often built out of, and was arguably superior in every way except possibly ease of use. Yeah, stone. Edoras, as it is shown in the movies, is at most a few miles from a massive mountain, but much closer are a series of rocky foothills. If this is where Edoras had to be, The people of Rohan would be imbeciles not to just quarry their stone nearby and build their settlement out of stone. You could make the argument that they didn't know how, and there is some lore to possibly back that up, at least to an extent, because it is stated that the people of Gondor excelled in stonecraft in ways that few others did. And it's also said in the Silmarillion that while the Noldor were great craftsmen and builders with stone, the Sylvan Elves, for example, had no skill at all with it, and built everything out of wood. However, I would argue that since the men of Rohan were allies of Gondor, that they could have sought help with the expertise in this case. But to keep things simple, let's just say Peter Jackson could have solved this whole issue with trees. Just show us readily available timber supplies nearby. A forest or something. It would not have taken much to explain why they used wood to build everything if they had a bunch of wood to use. After all, that's why we use wood in the US so much. 'Cause we've got a ton of it. Which brings us to the next problem with Edoras' depiction in the Lord of the Ring films, which is the wall. And to be fair, again, I'm not saying it's out of place, but the wall is a fairly simple palisade design. It appears to be a rock half wall, likely no more than 6 feet high, with a taller wooden palisade built into and above it. This is a classic fantasy design often used in Dark Ages design. It is simple and elegant, and of course the wall design is very effective against many things. It's tall and strong enough to act as an effective deterrent against wild animals, for example. In the world of Tolkien, nothing but a fell beast, a dragon, or a mumakil would be able to threaten the inhabitants of this city without the use of some greater intelligence. It also is more than enough to stop bands of criminals or even small raiding parties. Essentially, anyone that doesn't have access to a 15-foot ladder. There are a number of gates scattered around the wall as egress points for the city. These have simple gatehouses with double wooden doors, which can be barred shut on the inside. Again, there isn't anything necessarily wrong with this design, it's just that in a world of orcs, trolls, urukai, and wargs, and of course Dunlendings, you'd think the people of Rohan would want a little bit more. The wall appears to have partial battlements, so certain sections of the wall can be very well defended. There are towers dotted around the perimeter, so sightlines and shooting lanes would work provided you had enough men to defend the walls. But they are lacking in fortifications. The gatehouses lack any true defensibility, there are no murder holes, there's no double gates, there's no portcullis, and unfortunately, as there is no moat, there's no drawbridge. If all of that wasn't enough, the wall is the only defense the whole city has. There is just a single outer wall. Then, nothing. Just a bunch of scattered wooden houses inside. There are no secondary walls, no internal keeps, nothing that would offer any defense against a military attack. Once any enemy force had found its way through the gates or over the walls, Edoras would be conquered. There is no way to defend the city once the single layer of defense is breached. That is, of course, except for the giant rock that the Golden Hall is built upon. Yes, Meduseld sits high in the air overlooking the rest of the city, and the rock it's on is steep. This makes it all the more annoying that there isn't an inner wall with a second gatehouse, since the defensibility of this rock is the only reason I can imagine that it would be worth actually building anything here. And if that wasn't bad enough, the Golden Hall, Meduseld, isn't defensible either. It's just a wooden long hall out in the open. Sure, the enemy may be panting when they've climbed the hill to get there, but between the king and a band of Uruks only sits another wooden door. So it's not that the city can't be defensive for any reason, it just isn't. Other than those issues, we of course have size. This is supposed to be the population center for this area of Rohan, and the entire city consists of a few dozen buildings, perhaps 50 or so, if we're being generous. And we can't even assume that every single one of those is a house, as that wouldn't leave any storerooms, shops, inns, or any manufacturing buildings like mills or smithies. The size of the settlement from a building point of view is very, very bad. It does not look like the capital of an England-sized kingdom. It looks more like a provincial village. I would estimate the maximum occupancy of this supposed city to be no more than a few hundred people at most. It's just way too small. And you know what else? Where are the stables? In the film, we get the view of a stable while Gandalf and Aragorn are having a conversation. Inside, we see perhaps a dozen horses. Where are all the horses? I don't see dozens of stables in the city when I look at it. And if the stables are that size, you would need a lot of them. These are, after all, the horsemen. I don't know offhand how large the muster of Edoras was, but we know the total military of Rohan at the beginning of the War of the Ring was 100 Aerids, each one with 120 riders, which puts Rohan's total cavalry force at 12,000 men. And if we're being historically authentic, that would mean at least 24,000 war horses. We don't get exact numbers since Tolkien liked to avoid that issue, but Edoras was supposed to be able to muster around 1,000 riders itself, not counting outlying settlements in the rest of the King's Lands and Harrowdale. Historically speaking, this is a large force. That would likely mean the population of Edoras should be at least 5,000 or 6,000 people, but realistically, probably closer to about 10,000. So where are they all? Edoras should have at least 6,000 people living there. They should have around 1,000 horsemen, and that means at least 2,000 horses. But where are they all? Certainly not in the 50 or 60 small wooden houses that we can see. It would be one thing if Peter Jackson had decided to build large military barracks or giant stables somewhere in the city, but we don't get any realistic way to explain where everyone lives. Hell, if they wanted another easy way out, they could have just seen a bunch of villages and settlements scattered around the plains around Edoras. That way you could say the muster of Edoras actually comes from all of them, and most of the population doesn't actually live within the city walls, but in all of those littler non-distinct villages and farmsteads around Edoras. But unfortunately, the landscape around Edoras is best described as desolate. There is absolutely nothing as far as the eye can see, which in that case is actually really far, and that's in every single direction. So it's wrap-up time. What's wrong with the way Peter Jackson depicted the capital city of Rohan in his magnificent film trilogy? Pretty much everything. If we look at Edoras objectively, we should reasonably question, how was it built out of wood if there is no wood around for many miles? How do they feed the population of the city with no fields, no forests, no lakes, and no herds of cattle? Why would the city be built in such an exposed way that does so little to defend its population, which includes the king and his family? And lastly, how on earth could a settlement so tiny possibly house the thousands of men, women, children, and horses that are supposed to live there? And those questions are the issues that I wanted to discuss in relation to how Peter Jackson designed Edoras in The Lord of the Rings. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and this little look that we took at Edoras. I've wanted to do this one for a while now. I just hadn't decided exactly how I wanted to tackle this topic. Obviously, I absolutely love the films, so it's not like I'm just trying to attack and nitpick and everything, but it's one of those things that the more you love something, the more you watch it, and the more you notice the little things, especially if you study history. But with all that being said, if you have any recommendations, comments, questions, concerns, anything like that, definitely leave those down in the comment section below. But in any case, thanks for watching and have a nice day, and we'll see you next time.